used to write a blog in which I would take interesting garments and I would dissect them. I'd take them apart and see what was inside and learn from them. And I think it's only fitting that we now start taking apart meshes and dissecting them and learning from them. And today's mesh comes from Assyst's Vidya. In fact, it was provided by the freelance pattern maker Alexander Zegstel. So many thanks go out to Alexander for providing this simulation for us today. We're going to look at two different ways of exporting when you're in Vidya and you're exporting your simulation. You have the choice of exporting it with all your textures and your stitches and trims and everything, or without. And chances are, if you're watching this, it's because you're interested in moving from Vidya into a different software, maybe for some more texturing or for rendering or something. And so if you are going to go do some more texturing, you probably don't need all your stuff. So it's more advantageous to export it without them all. I'll show you why you may want to avoid exporting with your textures, because every software treats little details like this differently. And let's just get rid of that. Let's open, in fact, we're going to import a mesh with all of the settings. And there'll be two things to show. This is going to take a little while because there's a whole lot of textures and a whole lot of information. Now, the first thing I want to show you is that we see up here in the document tree that it's open, but we don't see the mesh. And this tells me that either it's really, really small or really, really big because the unit settings are off. Blender by default is in meters. Chances are Vidya's in millimeters. So this is probably really, really big. And while we could scroll in and out to see it, I find that sometimes when the object comes in, it's really big and you scroll out, you can corrupt the file. So rather than scrolling all over the place, what I do is see it's selected. We're just going to click in the viewport to deselect it and then reselect it again. We're in object mode. And then in this little flyout button here, maybe it's hard to see. Also, if I hit N, then it's going to give it to me. If we look at the top that says item, we can look at the properties of the item. And it says that the dimensions, well, in the z-axis is 1,087 meters long. It's a kilometer long, so we know that the scaling is completely off. So if I scrolled out, the reason we don't see it is because we're probably inside it. We're a little ant inside these giant pair of jeans. So the best way to bring it down is to use a scale tool. So we know that if it's a kilometer long and the jeans are probably really a meter, we're going to set this to 0.001. And we see something's happening, so we're probably right. The other thing is that they're lying face down. Well, we've seen the X rotation, it's set to 90, so I'm just going to set this to 0, and it pops back up. Before we go further, I just want to set the scale, because the scale should always be at 1, otherwise you have problems when you're doing some modeling or sculpting or other things later in the game. So how do we get it back to 1 with the object selected, or if it's deselected for some reason, as long as you're up here in object mode, select the object and hit Control A, which means to apply. So we're going to apply the scale, and you see how it turns back to 1. So now we're good. So you see that there's some stripes and things all over it. These are, among other things, stitches, and what Vidya has done is applied stitches. There's a little line, but the texture also comes with a sort of a stripe. And typically there would be an alpha channel which would make that stripe invisible, so you'd have to go into your stitches and figure out where the alpha channels and apply them all, and it's just kind of complicated. So maybe we just want to export without them and have a clean start. So let's just start over. So I would go back to New, General, don't save. Gives me my default cube, camera, and light. So I hit A for all, X for delete, because we don't want them. So we'll go through the file, import, OBJ. And this time, Alex had exported with no settings. Is that the right MTL? Nope, I want the OBJ, not the MTL. There we go. So right now we're in what is called solid viewport shading. So Blender has different ways of looking at an object. You can either look at, what is this, the solid view. You can look at the mesh with some transparency. You can look at a render preview, or you can look at the material preview. In this case, we want to look at the material. So we're going to click on this button, which is Material Preview. And let me just enable screencast keys. There we go. This is new. Just got it. So now in the lower left-hand corner, you can see the buttons I'm pressing and the things I'm doing with my mouse. So let's have a look at this. The interesting thing is that we see the texture that Vidya exported, the denim texture. That's all fine. That's perfect. This is what we expect. But inside, there are two things we don't expect. Now, if you're from the fashion world, of course you expect to see the underside of the fabric on the inside. But in the CG world, that's not normal. You don't have double-sided meshes. When you look at the backside of a mesh, you're supposed to see nothing or black. We won't get into normals and flip normals and things, but there's no such thing as a double-sided mesh. And so the fact that we see the inside of the fabric and we see some seam allowances going on, that's new and interesting. Though it's meant to make your life simpler, in programs like Clo and AccuMark 3D and things, they don't take seam allowances into account. You're working directly on seam lines, which is great. It's easy. But the people at Vidya have decided that, well, a real garment has seam allowances, so we should probably account for them. And it's actually quite clever. And this is one of the reasons why. Because with denim that has a very distinct two different sides to it, when you see the inside, the seam allowances are very prominent. They show up. But also, you might have other things that you want to show, like the stitching along the side to make it look quite realistic. There could be a number of reasons. Or maybe you want to simulate some thickness. You don't really see it in this one because the settings are pretty low, the thickness of the fabric. We see this little bump over here. That's an indication of some thickness of the seam allowance. That adds a little extra level of realness that if I was exporting from certain other programs, I'd probably have to bring it into Blender and start modeling that myself in order to create it. It's some extra work. Whereas with Vidya, I'm pretty positive, see there it is again, that little bump, that seam allowance. If we cranked the thickness of this, we'd probably have something that's looking quite realistic, which is really interesting. But let's go back to this idea that we see the inside. Over here on the right, you see this little button that looks like the world, and it's confusing because this one and this one look very much the same, whereas this button is world properties, and this button is material. I'm going to click on it, and we see that there's two materials. Now, there's a whole lot of technical stuff that came on the scan of the fabric, but clearly one says front side, and one says blah 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 Jarman AS jeans 0 pattern B. Chances are this is the backside of the fabric. This is the material, so it's a different texture file for the backside. So how did they apply the backside of the material to the backside of a mesh, which in Vidya or Clo or AccuMark would be easy, but it's against the rules in Blender. So let's have a little bit of a look. But before we do that, let's also look at the fact that we've got some thickness around the edges. Now let's talk about thickness. When you're simulating your pattern is flat. It's two-dimensional. There's no thickness information in your pattern. And in typical 3D fashion software, the software creates thickness depending on the physical properties of your fabric. So it'll beef it up. And so you're probably used to seeing this and it doesn't look weird to you at all. But to a CG professional, they're probably going, okay, well, how did that happen? So Vidya's generated this thickness like the other software. Now the issue with the other software is that when you export the mesh with that thickness, the information about the piece itself remains constrained to the pattern piece. So if you were to think about this being a lot thicker, this is a big heavy tweed, so maybe this edge is going to be a 1/4 inch thick. Well, that 1/4 inch edge actually has no texture information about it, because the texture information is contained within the space of the pattern piece itself. So what happens is when you take a pattern from, say, Clo into Substance Painter, it doesn't know what to do with the edge, so it just stretches pixels across the edge, and it looks pretty bad. So the workaround is that I would take my mesh in Clo or in AccuMark, export it as thin with no thickness information, bring it into Blender, apply a solidify modifier, then have to set seams all over the place and unwrap it. But if we go back into solid mode and then go into edit mode, so up in the left-hand corner, we see we're in object mode. That means I can select objects and it becomes highlighted in orange. Now if I want to edit this, I can either go to the drop-down mode and hit edit, or I can simply hit the tab key while it's selected. And we see the mesh. And here we see something very interesting. There's something going along around the edges of the mesh. That's that extra thickness that Vidya has created. But what makes it special is something that we'll see in a very small minute. We can see that we've got our seam allowances too. So now we get to sort of the point of this tutorial is UV mapping. And to get there, we go up to the very top, and this one's tricky. See, you wait till your cursor turns them across and drag across. We're going to open another window. And then in the drop down just above edit mode, where it looks like train tracks, I'm going to click there and go to the UV editor. Now, unfortunately, when it comes out of Vidya, the UVs, and UVs are basically, you think about, they're sort of like pattern pieces, but they're kind of not. And we'll get more into that in a second. But they're stacked on one on top of each other. And that's a problem because 3D software needs to be able to assign texture information to the pieces, and if they're stacked on top of each other, it throws out an error. So we need to be able to split these up. So one of the rules about UVs, as I said, was you need to have all your chunks. Well, in the old days, you had to have them all packed into one tile. Now many programs support a UDIM workflow where you can go across many tiles. But the easiest way to get these all separated out is just select them all. And let's go to UV. And we're going to say pack islands. And what that means is take all the pieces, spread them all out, and pack them as tightly as you can into this one tile. Because like marker making, in 3D, you want to make the best utilization of your space because the tile only has a certain amount of pixels to it. So the resolution is finite. So if your pieces are very small in a tile, you're going to have pretty lousy resolution. Whereas if you want better resolution, you want your pieces bigger relative to the tile. So we say pack islands, and it's split up our pieces. And there's several things to notice here. First, they're quite small relative to the tile, so we're going to have some real resolution issues. In fact, let's go over here and look at material preview. We see that, ooh, creepy. Suddenly our texture is not very good. The scale is out of whack. But notice that we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 backs. But in my mesh, there's only 2 backs. Well, so notice, remember I mentioned that there were 2 different materials. Vidya has actually created another mesh, another UV for the inside, for the wrong side of the fabric. So 2 of these pieces would be for the right side, and 2 of these pieces are for the wrong side. It's very clever. And what is all this stuff? Well, remember I mentioned that there was this thickness that had been created. Well, unlike some of the other programs that would just leave your pattern pieces, Vidya has actually created UV chunks. I mean, these are UV chunks which will now carry texture information to the edges, so you won't have that ugly pixel stretching that you would with other programs. The other thing about what they've done is they've made it a separate object. Well, no, it's not a separate object, it's a separate UV chunk, which makes it a little fiddly. But what is nice about that is that it leaves your main pieces very clean, shaped like the original pattern piece. Whereas if we were to unwrap from other programs, because of that wrap, sometimes they get distorted. So there's a lot to love about what's going on in what Vidya has done. So I mentioned that resolution is important and the size of our pieces is really important. So one of the things we're going to do first is we want to rescale everything. We are going to go into what's called a UDIM workflow, which means I can work across several tiles. So I can take some of these pieces and put them onto different tiles. And we need to rescale everything. Where if you look at tutorials on the internet where they're talking about texturing for maybe robots or spaceships, sometimes they'll talk about scaling things up and down and just to pack the tiles and use all the space. But then you get into non-uniformity. And because we're in fashion, we want to scale everything very uniform. If we like scale our like pieces to fit a tile and then take the pockets to another tile and scale them up so they fill a tile, the pattern is going to be totally different. if we had a plaid on your pant, for example, you could have maybe a 2-inch or 5 centimeter repeat down the pant. But because you scaled the pockets differently on another one, maybe you'll have a 1 centimeter repeat or a 0.5 centimeter repeat, and things are going to look goofy. So that's why it's important to scale uniformly. My pieces happen to be selected, but if you head click somewhere and they're black, to deselect them, it's quite simple. You just highlight them. You click a box around. The hotkey to scale would be S. So I click and I drag. But see, they're kind of dragging everywhere, and that's not what we want, so I hit escape. We'd like to scale them up relative to this box. So up here we have the pivot point, and currently it's set to bounding box center. So it's scaling relative to the center of all these pieces. We're going to change this to 2D cursor. And this is the 2D cursor. So now if we scale, it's going to scale relative to that. So I can watch the back of my pant, and I know that the back is the biggest piece. And I want to be able to fit it just inside the tile. Let's give us a little bit of room. But that's the scaling. But the next thing we're going to do is we want to organize ourselves by material. We've got all of our front sides and all of our back sides packed all together here. And to make it easier for us to work later, I would prefer to arrange it to have all my shell pieces together and all my inside pieces together. The other thing to note is that some of them are right side up and some of them are upside down. And in a denim layout, it probably doesn't matter. But I find it's usually best practices to get into the habit of pretending like you've got a one-way fabric. For example, if this were velvet, you know that everything has to be cut the same way and cut nap down. Or if this were a plaid, you'd want to be aligning certain pieces so that they match correctly. So generally, I find it's, even though we don't need to, I find it best to just pretend that this is a plaid or a velvet, because later if we were texturing, if we wanted to, if say this was denim and say, hey, this would look cool as a plaid or this would cool as velvet, and I hadn't done that layout, if I try to drop it in, suddenly it's going to look wrong. So how are we going to do that? First, we want to work by material, and everything's joined together now. So I mentioned object mode earlier. Right now we're in edit mode, everything's selected. If I were to click here and deselect, what happens? They all disappear. Well, why? Because in the viewport mode, it's only showing us in the UV editor the vertices that are selected. Right now nothing is selected. So let's hit all to select everything again. And now we're going to split things up. So how do we do that? I'm going to hit P, which is separate. So we can separate by selection, by material, or loose parts. In this case, because we know we have two materials and we want to work by material, I'm going to hit P and separate my material. And what that's done, see, I'm in edit mode, things are highlighted in orange. I'm just going to deselect, go into object mode. If I select, say, this front of this pan, we see that the front side material has been selected. Or if I select the back side is selected. So before we go on, we're going to do some housekeeping. This big long name is going to be important later in Substance. So let's change this. We know that this is the back side of the pattern. So over here, and if you're not in material preview, click on this little world button right here, this round one near the bottom. And then in this slot right here, we'll click on it. And we'll call this back side. Then we're going to do the same for the front. And just click here. Highlight everything to get rid of it. And call this front. This will be much easier to read later. So now it's created two different objects. In fact, let's rename the objects too. So we know this is our front side. So we renamed the materials just now. Now we're renaming the objects. This is the back side. So back into object mode, if I hit A, I'm going to select all, hit Tab to go into edit mode, hit A again to select all the vertices. We see all the pieces and how they're laid out. If I hit Tab to go back into object mode, and then click on just my front side pieces, hit Tab to go back into edit mode, we see that this is not a very optimized layout. And that's what I was talking about, organizing your pieces by material. There's something to know about these layouts and selecting these pieces. When you start selecting vertices, it's not going to select the whole piece. I could select a little bit here and select a little bit here. And then if I hit G for grab, which is really move, but it's confusing, and start dragging, see it's pulling my vertices, it's distorting my mesh. So you want to be careful about that. You want to only select the vertices that are attached to the piece that you want. You can either do that by dragging and shift clicking and doing a lot of things, but in many cases it's easier to use the L key. If I hover over a piece and I hit L, it's going to select all the vertices and faces that are linked to that piece. So if I hover over this one as well and hit L and hit G for grab and just drag them down, we're going to create a little bit of space for now to do our housekeeping. And as I mentioned, I like to have all my pieces going in one direction. So if I go back over here, hover over it, hit L for linked, and this time the hotkey is going to be R for rotate, and I want to turn it 180 degrees. But oops, it's turning around that cursor, because remember we'd sent it around the cursor. Well, I hit escape to get out of it. And then I'll go back up into here, and we're going to reset it to the bounding box center. Now I've hit R for rotate, and on my number pad, hit 180. If you're on a laptop and you don't have a number pad, this is not going to work. You'll have to get into number pad emulation, and that's the subject of a different video, not this one. So I've now turned them, but let's G for grab and move it over here. And we'll just set them down a bit for now, but later if we're replacing them, as I said, I like to have them lined up. They're pretty close. My plaids would be off by like maybe 1/8 of an inch, a couple millimeters. I would want to line them up real nice so that if I dropped in a plaid, they would match. I'm going to take my front pieces and just move them out of the way as well. Then I want to rotate this front piece, so R 180, and enter. And then I'll just move it over a little bit. And I'm going to go around and grab my main shell pieces and leave the seam allowances and the edge wraps. And we'll put them in different UV tiles. That'll make it easier. So I know this is a pocket bearer, and here's a yoke, and here's a fly. And here's a moment to pause and talk about why this may be important for you to learn, even if you're just a pattern maker. You may say, I'm never going to go work in Substance. That's for 3D artists. I won't do that kind of work. Chances are in the future, you'll be working for a company that has a 3D pipeline, meaning designers may work in a tool for creative purposes, and tech designers may work in a different tool for tech purposes, and then 3D artists may work in a different one for rendering and texturing. You're part of a system. We've been taught to think that in the fashion industry, you're tied to an ecosystem. If you work in Gerber, it's because you work in Gerber, and probably your cutters are Gerber, and your whole system is Acumark. If you work in Lectra, or if you work in Optitex, your whole system is one. If you look at the CG world, they don't do that. In order to produce a rendering, they probably work in 3 or 4 or 5 different things. They select the tools that are best for what they're trying to accomplish. And there's no one tool that's perfect for everything. So they have a pipeline, they have a workflow, and they probably have a whole lot of experience with these different tools, which we in fashion don't have. But somebody's going to be working with your file later down the road. And if I'm a 3D artist and I'm looking at this, I probably don't recognize what these shapes are, or maybe not super easily. And so if I'm going to be doing a UV layout, it may be a little difficult for me to place them in a logical manner that's correctly aligned so that things match, so that they're in the correct places. That's something that a technical designer knows better than anybody else. And so for you to fit into that pipeline and be the best person you can for that workflow, you're the best person to be doing this UV layout. So when you hand out your exported OBJ file, you've cleaned up the UV layout to the best, most logical manner for the people that come behind you and work in it. And they're going to love you for it, believe me. So before we go on, I want to point out I've got this phantom vertex here that I accidentally selected. So when I have these, if I try to move them, that vertex is going to pull. So not what we want. Escape, and then deselect everything. I'm going to go around and start selecting my pieces because I'm a technical designer and I know what they are. That's a yoke, that's a bearer, that's another fly piece, that's a pocket piece. I'm not sure what that is because it's not my pattern. There's another fly piece. Let's G for grab and move these all out of the way. We're going to bring them back later. Now, there's a waistband piece. There's another waistband piece. Let's move them. Let's go hunting for belt loops. Oh, there's a coin pocket. I'm not positive. This could be seam allowance pieces, but chances are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 belt loops, so chances are pretty good these are the belt loops. And here's another sort of indication of why it would be a really good idea for the technical designers of the world to do these UV layouts before handing off our work to other people in the pipeline. So let's grab what I think are belt loops, but these are the outside of the belt loops, and we know that there's probably an inside hiding somewhere. Are they near? That doesn't look right. The other belt loops had little things at both ends, and so while one or both of these could be the inside, I'm not sure. Oh, here's some pieces. 1, 2, 3, 4. Where's the 5th? These look more like seam allowance. Is that the 5th? That's the 5th. So we'll grab that one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And let's G for grab, move them somewhere else. So as I mentioned earlier, we're probably going to start retexturing in some other program, and we will. So we don't need this tile information. Up here we have that name, that big long name, fabric texture image jeans ungewaschen. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. It's German. That related to our material, and I think it was a hint when we renamed it that we don't need this image. So up on the X, I can just click and the image itself is gone. We're doing that because we want to get into the UDIM workflow. So how do we do that? In this window, again, we have the little arrow that's kind of hard to see, or I can just hit the N key and we get the flyout. If I go to View, here we have our UDIM grid. The grid works in columns and rows, and if I'm working in different materials and different sort of, here we've got some seam allowances and stuff that are secondary, I want to organize myself maybe in 2 different rows and multiple columns. We're probably going to need, well, we may need 2, maybe 3, maybe more. It's hard to tell at this point. So I'll start out by giving myself, let's say 3, and I can reduce it later. So that's 3 columns and then 2 rows. So maybe I can put my major shell pieces on the bottom and the seam allowance and things on the top. So now there's going to be a whole lot of moving around and reshuffling, so I'm going to speed things up. You're free to watch, and I'll be back in a few minutes at regular speed once I've done all this layout. And we're back. And there we have our pieces laid out. Now you may notice that I was grouping like shapes together, and it's not because I was trying to get the most utilization out of it, though maybe there was a part of that there. It's more that because we're not entirely sure what these pieces are, later in painting, it just saves us a lot of hassle of hunting around for pieces. If I'm trying to texture over a particular piece, I'm like, okay, I've got the right side, where's the left side? Or is this the right seam allowance? No, it's not. You don't want to be hunting all over your screen for things. So if you know basically the shape and the size of what it is, it makes it easier to search for like-shaped things. So that's what I was doing. Just put things that are similar together to make it easier to find them later. So that's our front side pieces. So if I go back to the viewport and I go out of edit mode back into object mode, I can now select the inside pieces. And then again, if I hit edit, or hit tab rather, to go into edit mode, there it shows my inside pieces all scrambled all over the place. So now I'm going to do the same thing for my inside pieces. So see you back in a minute. Now my layout for my inside is done. At this point, I'm probably going to want to add some trim. I'm going to want to add some buttons and some rivets and some studs and things. And either I would have modeled that in separate sessions, and then you can import your OBJ files, bring them in, or I can just start creating them within this project right now. It would be so simple as to go back into object mode and then hit not Control A, Shift A to add a mesh and start scaling. And then you can refer to some of my tutorials about creating buttons and things for ideas about how to create, like the button here and the rivets and the snaps. So we won't go into it now because I've covered it already. Have a little look through my YouTube channel or through the blog and you'll see how that's done. And then of course you're going to want to wrap those two in a similar kind of manner as we've just did. So let's assume that we're done. And then if we wanted to move into Painter, at this point we would export our OBJ file. So let's go to Export OBJ. Let's put it in the same folder and say Alex_udim. That's another practice you want to get into. Many programs don't like spaces, so just put underscores where you have spaces. Even if you don't need to, just get into the habit of it. So we'll export the OBJ. See those little numbers? That means it's done, and I'll see you in Painter.